My name is Ruth Goldman. I'm 78 years old from Boca Raton, Florida, and I'm about to tell you how my nephew, Stephen, thought he could forge my will to steal my $1.2 million estate while I was recovering from a mild stroke, not knowing he'd picked the wrong bubby to mess with. You see, I'd spent 38 years as an estate planning attorney in Manhattan, specializing in will contests and probate, fraud cases that other lawyers said were impossible to win. It started 5 months ago when I had what the doctors called a minor cerebrovascular accident, small stroke that left me with slight speech difficulties for about 6 weeks. At 78, any stroke is serious business, but thank God it was mild. The doctors at Boca Regional kept me for observation for 4 days, then sent me home with speech therapy and strict instructions to rest. My nephew Stephen, my late sister Sarah's boy, flew down from Long Island the day after my stroke. He seemed genuinely concerned, bringing flowers and those horrible hospital cookies that taste like cardboard. Stephen is 52 years old, a struggling insurance agent who'd never shown much interest in family until Sarah passed 3 years ago, and he suddenly became my closest living relative. "Aunt Ruth, I'm so worried about you," he said, holding my hand in that intensive care unit. "Promise me you'll let me help with anything you need. Legal papers, financial stuff, whatever. I know how hard it must be to think clearly right now." I should have seen the warning signs in that sentence. Stephen had never called me Aunt Ruth in his life. It was always just Ruth or Ruthie when he wanted money. And I'd been thinking perfectly clearly since 12 hours after the stroke. But I was still slurring some words due to temporary muscle weakness. During my recovery, Stephen visited every few days, always asking about my important documents and whether I needed help organizing my affairs. He'd offer to drive me to doctor appointments, then suggest stopping by my attorney's office just to make sure everything's in order. You know, "Aunt Ruth, after what happened to you, maybe we should review your will," he'd say. "Make sure it reflects your current wishes." I could call Harold Goldstein's office and set up an appointment. Harold Goldstein had been my estate attorney for 15 years, handling my retirement planning and the will I'd updated after Sarah died. Stephen knew Harold's name because I'd mentioned him when discussing Sarah's estate settlement. The first real warning came 6 weeks after my stroke, when Stephen started asking specific questions about my assets. How much was the Boca Raton condo worth? What about my investment accounts? Did I have life insurance policies he should know about in case of emergency? "Stephen, why are you so interested in my financial situation?" I asked during one of his visits. "I'm just worried about you, Aunt Ruth. You're getting older, you had a stroke, and I want to make sure you're protected. Family has to look out for family, right? Family has to look out for family." Those words would come back to haunt him. The discovery came 3 months after my stroke, when I received a call from Harold Goldstein's secretary, confirming my appointment for will revision the following Tuesday at 2 p.m. "I'm sorry, but I didn't make any appointment," I told her. "Oh, that's strange. Your nephew Stephen Goldstein called last week and said you'd asked him to schedule a will update. He said you wanted to make some changes to your beneficiaries, Stephen Goldstein." My nephew had used Harold's last name when making the appointment, hoping to create confusion and legitimacy. But he'd made one crucial mistake. Harold's secretary had known me for 15 years and knew I always made my own appointments. I hung up and immediately called Harold directly. "Harold, we need to talk. Someone's been impersonating family members to access information about my estate." "Ruth, I was hoping you'd call. I've been concerned about some unusual inquiries I've been receiving. Can you come in tomorrow? And bring identification, all of it." That afternoon, I sat in Harold's Park Avenue office, the same office where I'd worked for 12 years before starting my own practice, and learned the full scope of Stephen's betrayal. "Ruth, 3 weeks ago, someone calling himself Stephen Goldman contacted my office claiming to be your nephew and power of attorney," Harold explained. He requested copies of your current will, saying you'd had another stroke and couldn't communicate your wishes clearly. Did you give him anything? Of course not. But Ruth, he knew details about your estate that only family members should know. Your Boca address, Sarah's death date, even your social security number. He was very convincing. Harold pulled out a manila folder and showed me printed emails, phone records, and notes from his secretary. Stephen had been conducting a systematic campaign to gain access to my estate documents, using family information and my stroke recovery as his cover story. Harold, I spent 38 years prosecuting people like Stephen. I know exactly what he's trying to do, and I know exactly how to stop him. That evening, I sat in my Boca condo looking out at the Intracoastal Waterway, and I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. Stephen thought he was dealing with a confused elderly stroke victim who wouldn't notice her own will being forged. Instead, he'd declared war on Ruth Goldman, an estate planning attorney who'd never lost a probate fraud case in nearly 4 decades of practice. Stephen was about to learn that some bubbies spent their careers teaching criminals what happens when you try to steal from people who devoted their lives to protecting estates from exactly this kind of family predator. The war had begun, and only one of us was going to walk away with anything. Before I tell you how I destroyed Stephen, you need to understand exactly what he was trying to steal from me. For 40 years, I'd built my estate through careful legal work, smart investments, and sacrifices that my own nephew had watched me make for our entire family. I came to New York from Brooklyn in 1963 with a law degree from Brooklyn Law School and $200 in my purse. In 1963, law firms weren't exactly rolling out the red carpet for Jewish women, so I started as a secretary at Morrison, Feldman & Associates, doing estate planning work by day and studying for the New York bar by night. When I passed the bar in 1964, Morrison gave me a chance as a junior associate handling probate matters, the legal work nobody else wanted because it was detailed, time-consuming, and required dealing with grieving families fighting over money. I discovered I had a gift for estate law. I could read people's motivations, spot forged documents from across a room, and build cases that protected legitimate heirs from family predators who circled like vultures whenever someone died with money. By 1975, I was earning $35,000 a year, excellent money for a woman attorney in those days. But instead of spending it on luxury apartments or expensive clothes like my male colleagues, I was sending $500 a month to help my sister Sarah raise Stephen and his younger brother David after their father abandoned the family. Every month for 12 years, I wrote that check so Sarah could keep Stephen and David in decent schools, buy them proper clothes, and put food on the table. When Stephen needed glasses, I paid. When David needed dental work, I paid. When Sarah's rent went up, I made up the difference. "Ruth, you're an angel," Sarah would tell me during our weekly phone calls. "I don't know what we'd do without you." In 1976, I opened my own practice specializing in estate planning and will contests. My first big case was representing an elderly widow whose stepchildren had forged her husband's will to cut her out of a $400,000 inheritance. I won that case by proving the signatures were fake and the witnesses had been bribed. That victory established my reputation as the attorney you called when family members were stealing inheritances. Over the next 20 years, I handled hundreds of estate fraud cases, always representing the victims against the predators. The money from my practice allowed me to do more for Stephen's family. When Stephen graduated high school in 1989, I paid his entire tuition at Nassau Community College, $8,000 over 2 years. When he wanted to get his insurance license, I paid for the courses and licensing fees. When he got married in 1995, I gave him $15,000 for the wedding and honeymoon. But my biggest sacrifice came in 1998 when Stephen's insurance agency was failing and he was facing bankruptcy. He came to me with tears in his eyes, begging for help to save his business and his marriage. "Ruth, I need $75,000 to pay off my debts and keep the agency open," he pleaded. "I'll pay you back with interest, I promise. You're the only family I can turn to." I liquidated my entire stock portfolio, my retirement security, to give Stephen that money. Not a loan, a gift. Because that's what family does for family. Stephen never paid back a penny. And his insurance agency failed anyway, within 2 years. When Sarah was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 2010, I paid for her treatments, her medications, and her home care. Over 18 months, I spent $180,000 keeping my sister comfortable and fighting for her life. Stephen visited twice during her entire illness, both times to ask if I thought Sarah had updated her will recently. After Sarah died in 2012, Stephen inherited her house and her small savings account. Within 6 months, he'd sold the house and spent the money on a luxury vacation to Europe with his wife, posting photos on Facebook of expensive restaurants and 5-star hotels. That's when I should have realized that Stephen saw family money as his personal inheritance fund. In 2015, I retired and moved to Boca Raton, buying a beautiful condo overlooking the water for $450,000. I'd worked for 50 years and built an estate worth $1.2 million. My condo, investment accounts, life insurance, and jewelry that I'd collected over decades of successful legal practice. My will, drafted by Harold Goldstein in 2017, left everything to Jewish Family Services, Hadassah, and the Holocaust Memorial Foundation. Stephen would receive $25,000, a generous bequest considering he'd never paid back the $75,000 I'd given him 20 years earlier. But apparently, $25,000 wasn't enough for Stephen. He wanted it all. Over the past 3 years, Stephen had visited Florida 6 times, always asking questions about my estate planning and whether I'd considered updating my will to reflect current family situations. "Ruth, you know I've always been like a son to you," he'd say. "After everything you've done for our family, I hope you know how grateful I am." Grateful. The man who'd taken $250,000 from me over 30 years and never paid back a dime was grateful. Grateful. Enough to forge my will to steal everything I'd worked 40 years to build. Stephen had watched me sacrifice my own financial security to support his family for 3 decades. He'd seen me work 7 days a week building my legal practice. He knew every dollar in my estate had been earned through hard work, smart investments, and careful planning. And when I had a stroke and appeared vulnerable, Stephen decided all of that belonged to him. That was Stephen's choice. Now he was going to learn what happened when you tried to steal from someone who'd spent 40 years in courtrooms teaching judges and juries how to spot estate fraud and punish the criminals who committed it. What I discovered next revealed that Stephen's will forgery scheme was far more sophisticated and dangerous than I'd initially realized. This wasn't a desperate last-minute attempt to steal my inheritance. It was a carefully planned criminal enterprise that had been in development for over a year. 2 days after meeting with Harold Goldstein, I did what any retired estate attorney would do when facing potential fraud. I hired the best forensic accountant and private investigator money could buy. Jennifer Chen had worked with me on dozens of estate fraud cases during my practice, and her investigation firm specialized in uncovering financial crimes by family members. "Ruth, give me everything. Phone records, emails, bank statements, and a list of everyone who's had access to your personal information over the past 2 years, Jennifer said during our meeting at her Palm Beach office. Within 48 hours, Jennifer had uncovered a pattern of systematic preparation that made my blood run cold. "Ruth, your nephew has been researching estate fraud techniques online for 14 months, Jennifer reported, showing me printed screenshots from Stephen's social media accounts and browsing history. He's been visiting legal websites, reading articles about will contests, and even participating in online forums discussing how to challenge elderly relatives' mental competency. But the most damaging evidence was what Jennifer found in Stephen's financial records. He'd been accumulating massive debt, credit cards maxed out at $85,000, a second mortgage on his Long Island house, and business loans he couldn't repay. His insurance agency was failing again, and he owed the IRS $32,000 in back taxes. Stephen isn't just greedy, Ruth. He's desperate. Men in his financial situation often turn to elder financial abuse because they see elderly family members as easy targets with valuable assets. Jennifer's investigation revealed that Stephen had been collecting information about my estate for over a year, using family conversations and my own generosity against me. Every time I'd mentioned Harold Goldstein's name, every detail I'd shared about my investments, every comment about my health, Stephen had been taking notes and building a file. But the most shocking discovery came when Jennifer traced Stephen's recent activities. 3 weeks before my stroke, 3 weeks before, Stephen had contacted a document forger in Queens, paying $20,500 for fake identification documents and practice signature sheets. Ruth, your nephew was planning this fraud before you even had your stroke. He was just waiting for the right opportunity, a medical event that would make you seem vulnerable and potentially incompetent. Jennifer showed me surveillance photos of Stephen meeting with the forger, bank records showing the $2,500 payment, and copies of the fake IDs he'd ordered bearing Harold Goldstein's name and office address. Stephen was planning to impersonate your attorney, forge a new will naming himself as your sole beneficiary, and then file it for probate after your death. If anyone questioned the will, he'd claim your stroke had affected your judgment and that he was simply following your final wishes. The masterpiece of Stephen's scheme was a folder Jennifer discovered in his car, a complete file on my medical history, financial assets, and legal documents. He'd been preparing for months to convince a probate court that I was mentally incompetent due to my stroke, and that he, as my loving nephew, was simply honoring my wish to leave everything to him. But Stephen had made one crucial mistake in his criminal planning. He'd underestimated the woman he was trying to rob. That afternoon, I called Detective Maria Santos from the Palm Beach Sheriff's Economic Crimes Unit. Maria had worked with me on several estate fraud prosecutions during my practice, and she understood the complexity of these family financial crimes. Ruth, what you're describing is textbook elder financial abuse with sophisticated fraud planning, Maria said after reviewing Jennifer's evidence file. Forgery, identity theft, conspiracy to commit fraud. We're looking at multiple felonies that could put your nephew in state prison for 10 to 15 years. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Maria, but I wanted more than criminal prosecution. I wanted to destroy Stephen's life the same way he'd planned to steal mine. My first call was to Stephen's mortgage company. Armed with Jennifer's evidence of his financial crimes and fraud planning, I provided them with documentation showing that Stephen was engaged in criminal activity that posed a risk to his ability to repay his loans. Ma'am, thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll be reviewing Mr. Goldstein's account for potential fraud indicators and may accelerate the loan terms if necessary. Next, I contacted the New York Department of Financial Services, which regulates insurance agents like Stephen. I filed a formal complaint, including evidence of his attempted elder fraud, identity theft, and financial crime planning. Ms. Goldman, insurance agents are required to maintain high ethical standards. If Mr. Goldstein is convicted of financial crimes, he'll lose his license permanently. But the most satisfying call was to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Stephen's $32,000 in unpaid taxes, combined with evidence that he was planning to commit fraud to obtain money, made him a priority target for federal investigation. Ma'am, tax evasion combined with elder fraud planning represents a pattern of financial crimes that we take very seriously. We'll be opening an investigation immediately. That evening, Stephen called me as he had every week for months, still playing the role of concerned nephew. "Hi, Aunt Ruth. How are you feeling? I was thinking about visiting next week." "Stephen, that's so sweet of you to call," I said warmly. "I've been thinking about family a lot lately. About loyalty, about trust, about what family really means." "That's wonderful, Aunt Ruth. Family is everything." "You're absolutely right, Stephen. Family is everything. And I've learned so much about our family lately. So much I never knew before." There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "Oh, just how much you've been looking out for me, sweetheart. How you've been planning for my future, making sure everything's taken care of. I know about your visits to Harold's office, your concern about my will, and your research into estate planning. I know about everything." The silence on the other end stretched so long I wondered if he'd hung up. "Stephen, are you there?" I don't know what you mean, Aunt Ruth." "Of course you do, darling. But don't worry. Everything's going to be taken care of, just like you wanted. Very soon now." After I hung up, I sat in my living room overlooking the Intracoastal Waterway and smiled for the first time in months. Stephen thought he'd been hunting a vulnerable elderly stroke victim who wouldn't notice her will being forged. Instead, he'd declared war on a retired estate fraud prosecutor who'd spent 40 years destroying people exactly like him. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since retiring 7 years ago. I put on my best Navy courtroom suit, arranged my silver hair in the professional bun I'd worn to practice for 40 years, and walked into the offices of Morrison, Kellner and Associates, like I was reporting for the most important case of my career. James Morrison III, son of my original mentor, had maintained our professional relationship throughout my retirement. When his secretary announced me, James came out personally with the respect accorded to legendary attorneys. "Ruth Goldman, what brings the estate fraud hunter back to active duty?" "James, I need to retain your firm for a complex criminal matter. This time, it's personal." For the next 3 hours, I laid out Stephen's criminal scheme with the precision of the prosecutor I'd been for 4 decades. Jennifer Chen's investigation file, Detective Santos's criminal case documentation, and my own legal analysis created an airtight prosecution framework. "Ruth, this is the most thoroughly documented elder fraud case I've ever seen," James said, reviewing my materials. "Your nephew isn't just facing state charges. This is federal wire fraud, mail fraud, and organized financial crime. James, I don't want just criminal prosecution. I want complete financial destruction. Civil RICO claims, asset forfeiture, and judgment liens that follow him for the rest of his life." That afternoon, James filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit seeking $2.4 million in damages, double my estate value under Florida's elder abuse statutes, plus punitive damages for emotional distress and fraud planning. Under Florida law, attempted elder fraud carried the same penalties as completed fraud. But criminal prosecution was only half of my revenge strategy. I wanted Stephen to lose everything he valued, starting with his professional livelihood. Detective Santos had been building the criminal case with methodical efficiency. Stephen's document forger, faced with trafficking and false identification charges, agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for reduced sentencing. Mrs. Goldman, your nephew paid for fake IDs, practiced forging legal signatures, and specifically discussed plans to impersonate an attorney for estate fraud purposes, Detective Santos reported. "We have recordings, bank records, and physical evidence. This case will result in conviction." The federal investigation expanded when IRS criminal investigation agents discovered Stephen's scheme involved mail fraud and wire fraud across state lines. He'd used postal services and electronic communications to research my assets and plan the forgery, making it a federal crime. "Ma'am, Your nephew is facing federal charges carrying 10 to 20 years in prison, plus full asset forfeiture of anything purchased with fraudulently obtained funds, Special Agent Rodriguez explained. But the most satisfying justice came from the Professional Licensing Board. The New York Department of Financial Services moved swiftly once presented with evidence of Stephen's criminal planning. Ms. Goldman, insurance agents found guilty of financial crimes face permanent license revocation and prohibition from working in any financial services industry, the investigator informed me. Within 2 weeks, Stephen received notice that his insurance license was suspended pending criminal investigation, effectively ending his career and primary income source. Next came his mortgage acceleration. Stephen's lender, armed with evidence of his criminal activity and financial fraud planning, demanded immediate payment of his outstanding loan balance, $285,000 he couldn't possibly pay. Mr. Goldstein, criminal activity violates your mortgage agreement terms. You have 30 days to satisfy the full loan amount or face foreclosure proceedings. I also contacted Stephen's credit card companies and business creditors, providing them with legal documentation of his fraud charges and criminal investigation. Within days, his credit lines were frozen and his accounts called for immediate payment. But the centerpiece of my legal strategy was something I'd perfected over 40 years of estate fraud, prosecution, using the criminals' own planning against them in civil court. James Morrison filed a motion for emergency asset seizure, arguing that Stephen's documented fraud planning showed clear intent to steal my estate and that his current assets were subject to forfeiture as proceeds of attempted criminal activity. Your Honor, the defendant spent over a year planning to defraud my client of her $1.2 million estate, James argued before Judge Patricia Williams. His own documents show premeditation, criminal conspiracy, and systematic preparation to commit elder financial abuse. Judge Williams, who'd seen countless estate fraud cases during her career, was not impressed with Stephen's defense. Mr. Goldstein, the evidence presented shows clear intent to commit multiple felonies targeting an elderly family member. I'm granting the plaintiff's motion for asset preservation and appointing a receiver to oversee your financial affairs pending resolution of criminal charges. Stephen's Long Island house, his remaining business assets, and his bank accounts were frozen pending trial. He couldn't sell anything, couldn't access his money, and couldn't pay his mounting legal fees. 3 weeks into the legal proceedings, Stephen's public defender contacted James Morrison seeking a plea agreement. Mr. Morrison, my client is willing to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for reduced sentencing. He's also asking if Mrs. Goldman might consider accepting an apology and restitution. James relayed the message to me that afternoon during our strategy meeting. Ruth, Stephen wants to make a deal. His attorney says he'll plead guilty, apologize publicly, and pay restitution for emotional damages. I looked at James with the expression I'd perfected over 40 years of prosecuting criminals who preyed on elderly victims. James, you can tell Stephen's attorney that Ruth Goldman, loving aunt, died the day I discovered her nephew was planning to forge her will and steal her life savings. Ruth Goldman, estate fraud prosecutor, has no interest in showing mercy to career criminals who target elderly family members. The trial proceeded with the efficiency I remembered from my prosecutorial days. Stephen's own documents, his forger's testimony, and the systematic evidence of his criminal planning created an airtight case that even his overworked public defender couldn't challenge. Stephen accepted a plea bargain after just one court appearance. 7 years in state prison, full restitution to all victims, and permanent prohibition from working in financial services. But the criminal case was only the beginning of Stephen's destruction. The civil lawsuit, the asset forfeiture, and the professional consequences would follow him for the rest of his life. Stephen had thought he was dealing with a confused, elderly stroke victim who wouldn't notice her will being forged. Instead, he'd targeted a retired estate fraud prosecutor who'd spent 4 decades perfecting techniques for destroying people exactly like him. The final phase of Stephen's destruction unfolded with the systematic precision I'd learned from 4 decades of prosecuting estate fraud. By the time I was finished, Stephen had lost not just his freedom, but every aspect of the life he'd tried to steal from me. The civil judgment came down 6 months after Stephen's criminal sentencing. $1.8 million in damages and punitive awards under Florida's elder abuse statutes. Judge Williams ruled that Stephen's systematic planning and criminal conspiracy warranted maximum penalties allowed by law. The defendant engaged in sophisticated criminal planning, targeting an elderly family member who had supported him financially for over 30 years. Judge Williams stated during the civil judgment hearing, "This represents the most egregious form of elder abuse, betrayal of family trust combined with criminal fraud." Under Florida asset forfeiture laws, everything Stephen owned was liquidated to satisfy the judgment. His Long Island house sold for $320,000, his business assets for $45,000, and his personal property for another $12,000. Even his car was sold at public auction. But the most satisfying moment came when Stephen's wife, Linda, filed for divorce, citing his criminal conviction and financial destruction as grounds for dissolution of marriage. Linda received custody of their 2 children and moved back to her parents' house in New Jersey, taking the children away from their father permanently. Ruth, Stephen's wife, contacted me requesting character references for her divorce proceedings, James Morrison reported. She wanted the court to know that Stephen had deceived her about his criminal activities and that she had no knowledge of his fraud planning. Professional consequences followed Stephen into prison and would continue long after his release. The New York Department of Financial Services permanently revoked his insurance license and placed him on a prohibited persons list that would prevent him from working in any financial industry for life. But I wanted more than Stephen's professional destruction. I wanted him to understand the full scope of what he'd lost. Through his betrayal, I hired Jennifer Chen to continue monitoring Stephen's prison communications and visits. What she discovered gave me profound satisfaction. Stephen had been abandoned by everyone who'd ever mattered to him. Ruth? Stephen has received no visitors during his first year of incarceration, Jennifer reported. His wife won't take his calls. His children refuse to communicate with him, and his former business associates have cut all ties. He's completely isolated. The community response in Stephen's Long Island neighborhood was swift and decisive. Word spread quickly about his elder fraud conviction and the systematic way he'd betrayed his aunt, who'd supported him for 30 years. The neighbors we interviewed described Stephen as disgusting and a disgrace to his family, Jennifer reported. Several mentioned that they'd always suspected he was taking advantage of your generosity, but they never imagined he'd commit actual crimes against you. But the most powerful consequence was what happened to my estate planning. I contacted Harold Goldstein to update my will one final time, creating a legacy that would ensure Stephen's betrayal served a greater purpose. Harold, I want to establish the Sarah Goldman Foundation for Elder Financial Abuse Prevention, I told him during our final meeting. My entire estate will fund legal assistance for elderly victims of family financial crimes. The foundation would provide free legal representation for seniors whose families were stealing from them, fund investigation services like Jennifer Chen's firm, and educate the community about recognizing and preventing elder financial abuse. Ruth, this foundation will help hundreds of elderly victims who don't have your legal expertise and resources, Harold said as we finalized the documentation. Stephen's betrayal will end up protecting other families from the same crimes he tried to commit. But I wasn't finished with Stephen yet. I wanted him to understand the full consequences of his choice to betray family trust. I wrote Stephen one letter during his 2nd year of imprisonment. The only communication I would ever send him. Stephen, by the time you receive this letter, you'll have served 2 years of your 7-year sentence for attempting to forge my will and steal my estate. I thought you should know what your betrayal has accomplished. Your wife has remarried a decent man who treats your children with the respect and love you never showed your own family. Your children call him Dad now and haven't spoken your name in over a year. Your house was sold to pay the civil judgment against you. The new owners are a lovely young family who actually appreciate what they have instead of scheming to steal more. Your insurance license has been permanently revoked, and you'll never work in financial services again. When you're released in 5 years, you'll be 59 years old with a felony record and no marketable skills. But here's what I want you to understand. Stephen, your betrayal didn't just destroy your life. It created something beautiful. My entire estate will fund the Sarah Goldman Foundation for Elder Financial Abuse Prevention, named after your mother, who would have been ashamed of what you became. The foundation will provide free legal assistance to elderly victims whose families are stealing from them, the same crime you attempted against me. Every senior citizen we help will benefit from your betrayal, and every criminal we prosecute will face the same justice you received. You thought you could steal from the aunt who'd supported you for 30 years, but instead, you've ensured that hundreds of other elderly victims will receive the protection and justice they deserve. Your mother, Sarah, raised you better than this, Stephen. She taught you about family loyalty, respect for elders, and the importance of earning what you receive in life. You chose to ignore every lesson she tried to teach you. I hope you use these 5 remaining years in prison to think about the man you could have been versus the criminal you chose to become. But don't expect forgiveness from me when you're released. I've spent my entire career teaching people like you that actions have consequences. Ruth Goldman, founder. Sarah Goldman Foundation for Elder Financial Abuse Prevention. Today, I'm 80 years old, living comfortably in my Boca Raton condo with a profound sense of peace I never expected to find after such a personal betrayal. The foundation I established has helped 47 elderly victims recover over $2.3 million stolen by their own family members. Every case we win, every criminal we prosecute, and every family we protect serves as a reminder that Stephen's betrayal ultimately served justice rather than greed. Sometimes people ask me if I ever regret destroying Stephen so completely, if I think I was too harsh with my own family. But I sleep peacefully every night knowing that I taught Stephen the most important lesson of his life. Betraying the people who love you carries the highest price of all. Stephen thought he'd found the perfect victim in his elderly aunt, who'd suffered a stroke. Instead, he learned that some women spent their careers perfecting techniques for destroying people exactly like him. The last thing I want to say to anyone watching this is simple. Protect your elderly family members, but never let family loyalty make you a victim of their crimes. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is ensure that criminals face the full consequences of their choices, even when they share your blood. Because when family members turn into predators, the only response is justice, swift, complete, and permanent. Every story we tell carries the echoes of countless others who have walked similar paths. This grandmother's tale is now part of your journey too. Subscribe to continue collecting these precious life lessons together. Remember, we're all just stories in the end. Let's make them meaningful ones.